We often have the fantasy that congregations should be peaceful communities free of conflict. We can become frightened and distressed when we're asked as leaders to deal with conflicts that arise.
It can be helpful to learn that conflict is inevitable in communities where we care so deeply about our values and yet have so many diverse opinions about how to live out these values.
The Reverend Dr. Peter Steinke talks with us about how a systems perspective can help us understand and address the conflicts that can arise among us.
Church conflict is a growth industry. My guess is that in any 5-year period, 40% of the congregations in this country are in some level of conflict. And that about a third of that number deal with conflict successfully, or to some degree where there's movement. Now, in the last 4 or 5 years, I've been doing this since 1988, incidentally, and I've worked with about 160 churches in 8 different denominations. In the last 5 years, the nature of the conflict is becoming more mean-spirited. People have been more aggressive. People want to win. It's not a matter of finding a common ground or seeking reconciliation. It's a matter of getting my way. And in order for me to be right, I often have to prove that you're wrong. And if you don't like it, you can leave. Now, this may be somewhat representative of our larger society, but that's just what's happening in congregations across the country, irregardless of the denomination. I have discovered 13 major triggers of anxiety, and this can be an instrument that you could use for yourselves. There obviously are more than 13 triggers, but these are the major ones. There was a pastor in Iowa who called me, and he said, "Steinke, you'll remember me. I was at your workshop. I'm the guy who told you we have 15 of those 13 triggers." He didn't tell me what the other 2 were. But these are the ones I find most often. Now, just one of the 13, if there's enough emotionality connected to it, can create problems. You wouldn't have to have all 13. One by itself. What I find most often is that 5 or 6 of these are happening serially or simultaneously. And I often say to a congregation, you should be anxious because these situations have come upon your life together, and it would be natural for you to be anxious. And my point is to them, it's not your anxiety that is the problem. It will always be what you will do with that anxiety. And I say to them, the reason you have hired me as an interventionist is so that you do not waste your suffering. Because if you do not use this as a learning opportunity, more than likely you're going to repeat it. Because nothing fundamentally has changed in the system. So I see conflict as an opportunity for learning and growth and change. About 40% of the congregations I work with fundamentally change. And it's pretty much up to the leadership in the congregation whether it's going to happen. All right, let's look at these 13 triggers for a moment. Money. Follow the money trail. Follow the anxiety. Is there anybody here from Shelter Rock? When I spoke to the large church conference in San Diego, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I had lunch with folks from Shelter Rock. I didn't know Shelter Rock was exceptional in any way. I just happened to sit there. And after that, one of the women from Shelter Rock, I forgot her name, she invited me to come and do a workshop. And she asked me what my fee was, and I told her. And she said, well, could you double that so the people think you're worth it? I said, if you're interested in value, I could do far better than doubling. But I remember talking to these people and saying they had anxiety about money too, in terms of how do we distribute it, how do we have better stewardship from our own people, and etc. I've worked with 7 congregations that have endowments larger than 35 million, and their stewardship is all poor. And it affects the life of the congregation too. But money is just an anxiety provoker. How do we get it? How do we distribute it? We don't have enough of it. Next, type of worship. There are those that like contemporary worship. There's like those that like traditional worship. There are those that like what they call blended worship. Well, I understood something one day when I went back to the story of Cain and Abel, and I thought, you know, the first murder in the Bible is all about worship. And we've had worship wars ever since. One son's sacrifice was accepted, and the other son's was not accepted. I think worship becomes so important emotionally because that's where people have their greatest exposure and spend most of their time with the congregation. So when you make change at the worship level, you threaten people's identity or something at a level nothing else would do. You could change curriculum sometimes, and that doesn't seem to have the same effect as changing the type of worship. Issues involving sex and sexuality. Every Christian church is dealing with this issue. The Presbyterians are meeting currently in Birmingham to discuss this. Lutherans dodged the bullet last year in not changing their policy in terms of blessing same-sex marriages or ordaining sexually active ordained people. But this is such a hot button. Just to have the discussion sometimes will create anxiety in the system. Next, this is the biggie I was talking about that happens to be mentioned more and more, pastors' leadership style. I was in Hanover, New Hampshire, an Episcopal church that's 260 years old. It's right by the campus of Dartmouth. And the pastor, the rector, was under fire for not being a good administrator. And there are probably 100 people there during this meeting. And the person who was the head of the search committee that brought the current rector to that congregation stood up and said, I hope you all remember when I presented him as a candidate, I said to you he had great pastoral skills, but he was not necessarily a good administrator. And now he's under fire for being a poor administrator. And I think that's unfair. Well, I had done a study of their rectors over the last 50 or 60 years, and they had had a lover, an administrator, a lover, an administrator, a lover, an administrator, and now they've gone back to a lover. And that's not to say you can't have the two together, but it's an odd situation if you do. And that happens so often. The congregation will have somebody with this set of skills, and they feel they've missed out on these other set of skills, so they go for somebody just the opposite, but not remembering they're not going to have what they did have, because usually no one has a full quiver of talent. But that's what we mean when we talk about pastor's leadership style. Plus, we do know size has something to do with how you function. Arlen Rutledge, an Episcopal priest, has talked about the family-sized church, the pastor-sized church, the program-sized church, and the mega-church, or corporate church. And different pastoral skills are required because of the sheer size. And how pastors function will be different because of the size. Next, old versus new. Now this can be anything. Old time of service, new time of service. Old hymn book, new hymn book. Old way of holding hands, new way of holding hands. I don't know. I mean, I could be facetious on this. Anything old, new can just do it. Okay? I remember one pastor saying he just came to this church and he placed the Bible down. He was right-handed and he put it on the right side. And somebody told me after the service he put it down on the wrong side. Because the previous pastor had put the Bible where? On the left side. It's amazing how we get familiar with something and we get sensitive to anything changing old and new. Growth versus survival. Some churches do get anxious because they're growing. And they're no longer small, and you don't always know everybody. But they're a minority because 80% of the churches in America today are at a plateau or are in decline. So most congregations are worried about survival. I was invited to work with a Lutheran church on the west side of Houston that in 3 years jumped from 300 members to 1,700. And they had been 300 members for like 25 or 30 years. But massive growth happening on the west side of Houston. They asked their pastor to resign. They said, "Pastor, your skill lies with the congregation of 300. Now, he had been a good pastor, so a lot of people felt very close and connected to him. So they felt he was being forced out, and they were anxious. And that's when they called me in to work with them. But he took a call to a church about 400 members, and he's thriving. He's doing well. That's where his gifts are. They then interviewed the 21 largest ELCA congregations in America to discover what are the traits, characteristics, qualities of a pastor of a 1,700-member congregation. And they had purchased 27 acres, so they were figuring they were probably going to go up to 5,000. They showed me the list and asked me to make any comment. I read over the list and I said to them, "I have to be honest with you, I feel real queasy." And they said, "What's the issue?" I said, "Well, I see the word dynamic here 8 times. Dynamic, 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 dynamic. What do you mean by dynamic? Do you mean someone will come here and have sex with 6 women? Is this dynamic?" It got real quiet. But I said, "You sit here like fly paper for a narcissist. You need somebody here who doesn't need you." Okay? Well, obviously, this congregation just sat there for somebody like that, and that's what I was trying to get across. Actually, I did get the message across because when I left, the president of the congregation said to me, "Reverend Steinke, thank you for your dynamic presentation." Touche. Staff conflict, resignation of staff members. People today emotionally attach not just to the senior pastor, but to different people on the staff, if there's a staff. And they become emotionally attached to that particular staff person. So if that person is in conflict with another staff person or with some segment of the congregation, they feel threatened because that's their lifeline emotionally to the congregation. So staff conflict, staff resignation is a big one when it comes to anxiety. Internal or external focus. The pastor spends too much time in the community and not enough with the congregation. That's an internal, external problem. Or the pastor spends too much time with regional or district responsibilities and not enough with the congregation. That's an internal, external. We should design our worship to attract the seeker. No. The other side says we should design our worship for those who are the insiders. And that's an internal, external focus. Major trauma, tension, or transition. Major trauma, pastor commits suicide. Pastor's murdered. Church burns down. Major transition, the pastor who founded the church leaves and takes a new call. The pastor's been there for 20 years, retires. 5 of 6 staff people leave in a year's time. We are very vulnerable to anxiety when there's trauma or there's tension. In fact, more so than we realize mentally. Harm done to a child, the death of a child. I could probably spend a whole hour and just give you examples of what clergy have told to me about this one right here. This often surprises people. But at some level, we should be able to control life and protect the young. And if life is that random and haphazard, we feel very vulnerable and anxious. When there is harm done to a child, death of a child, and the child could be 22. Doesn't have to be 2 years old. It also could be a child in the neighborhood, not necessarily in the community, but it just arouses anxiety in the system. The gap between the real and the ideal. I thought this was a real, loving, caring, friendly congregation. And now I see these people have clay feet, and I don't know if I really like them. Or the pastor presented all these wonderful ideals, and I found out she had clay feet. When the ideal and the real don't match, it's very painful. Next. Anything that has to do with building, construction, space, territory. I always go through this when I fly, because between my seat and the next seat, there is a common armrest. And usually whoever gets there first wants squatters' rights. But it's not necessarily what the other person has in mind who comes later, okay? And there could be this elbowing and arm thing. We just become emotional about space, territory, buildings. Next, boundary violations. I did an intervention with a Presbyterian church on the West Coast, 2,500 members, and they just gone through a $15 million building program. And the elders, there were 15 elders, had confronted the senior pastor and asked for his resignation. Now, everything had been going fine in this congregation. They'd just been through this big building program, had raised the money. But during this period of time, they'd been working with this pastor for about 12 months. He had done a lot of lying and dissembling. The boundary violations included he wanted to get rid of a staff member, so he asked the associate pastor, who was that person's supervisor, to make sure he changed her evaluation so it was negative so he could fire her. That's a boundary violation. Okay. Another person was asked to leave, and he reported that this person voluntarily left for other opportunities. But when someone went to the staff member and asked, "Why did you leave?" it was very clear that this person said, "Because the senior pastor didn't want me here anymore." Well, these are things that I've been talking about. These are all boundary violations. What I have learned that as people become more aggressive in their behaviors, that if I don't stay in control of the process, I lose it. And I have to have those ground rules. And sometimes this is what doesn't happen in congregations. You don't have clear ground rules sometimes when you're dealing with an issue. And what is it or what is it that we cannot do? And unfortunately in congregations we don't have a good apparatus, a good mechanism to deal with some of these problems when they arise in terms of conflict. And things just get flying all over the place. But I have learned in my experience that as people become more aggressive, you have to have these ground rules in place. And people agree to them, and then if they violate them, the process is over. So that creates a problem because congregations often go into denial. We don't have a problem. Or they simplify it. Well, our problem isn't that bad. You should have seen what it was like 5 years ago. Or you should see what my sister's church had to go through last year. But this all as a way to stop it. And I don't know how you change things unless someone puts it on the table. Now, people get upset with me because I tell them, here are some of the problems. I don't create these problems, and so that you get upset. I'm just reporting back what you told me are your problems. Okay? And here are the things you really need to work on. And I never tell an anxious system they have 15 problems. That's too many. They can't deal with more than 3 or 4 problems, major issues. So that's what I put down. And also, in my reports, I never give recommendations. I don't want to be the superior person telling the inferior what they need to do. I disempower them. So I raise a lot of questions. And I ask provocative questions because I want them to get them to the thinking brain and see if I can get them away from the instinctive brain. Like in one Episcopal church, I said, have you people deluded yourself into thinking that you've come here to be disciples of Jesus, when in reality you've come here simply to be connoisseurs of good liturgy and preaching? Well, one man stood up and said, who the hell are you to judge us? I said, I haven't judged you. I just asked the question. Okay? But I'm glad he reacted because I kind of know I hit the button. See, as a therapist, I learned you hit the button when people vociferously deny it, change the subject, make light of it, etc. The lower brain gives me some information that they don't know they're giving to me. And this guy just really ran me up and down. But I asked the questions to put them up here. I also have a session called Tell It to Peter. I have never wanted to go into a congregation and just have vent your spleen and get it off your chest and let it blow the air, because all you're doing is exercising what we call as the lower brain. And that's where our instinctive behavior comes. The lower brain doesn't think. It just reacts. So I don't want to exercise the non-thinking brain. I want to get people to think. So I invented this process called Tell It to Peter, because people do need to speak. And congregation's invited. It's a public meeting. There's a microphone. People come up to the microphone, but they speak to me. They don't speak to the audience. And there are ground rules. Again, 2 minutes. You can't attack. You can't hiss, boo, cheer, and et cetera, et cetera. I may ask you some questions and engage you in a conversation. But I do that so people get to the thinking brain. And when there's a violation, I have to call people to task that that's not part of what we wanted to do. Now, why is it that some congregations are willing to deal with the conflict while others are not? First of all, those that are willing will not impede your putting out what it is that are the major issues. In other words, put it on the table. Let us see it. They don't try to gerrymander or fix or manipulate that process. You just put it out there. Secondly, they have a willingness to begin to address the issue so we can take steps to ameliorate, shift, or change those issues. In congregations that don't have good results, tend to want to minimize the tension and to kind of make their issues light issues, neutralize them, and they don't really put any teeth into their strategies to get at what's dealing with them. And a lot of that has to do with leadership. I also believe that if you have been in a conflict for about 7 to 9 months and no change is made, you pretty much need an outside person. You're stuck. You're paralyzed. Because this is what happens with a lot of congregations. When it's highly anxious, they get paralyzed. I have no interest in mediation. I'm not a mediator. I don't care if people agree. That's not my philosophical premise about conflict. what I see is the congregation has frozen. It doesn't want to do anything. But everybody's unhappy, and it's just getting worse. So I call my process levitation. I want to move it. I want it to see if it can't make some change in how it functions. And that's why I set up the process that I did. But if you're into it 7 or 9 months, you need somebody to help you levitate that system because the paralysis will stay there. Now, I don't often tell audiences this, but I'll tell you a little secret. There are only about 5 things that happen when there's a conflict. There's not 50 million things. 5 things and nuances attached to each of these 5 things. A, 2 parties are at odds with each other. In order for the system to calm down or be peaceful, either A or B leaves. 2, A and B are at conflict, and the other party leaves rather than the first party. That's the second thing. So it's just a repeat of the first one, but the other party leaves. 3, there is the issue, and because of forces in the system, they don't deal with the issues. Nobody leaves, and the problem goes underground. But I can assure you the problem will resurface in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, and you're going to deal with it again. 4, they don't do anything about it. They just let it lie around, and the tension just pops up every so often. And 5, there's a real desire to make some change or to reconcile. I mean, basically, one of these 5 things happens. Just because people leave, number 1 and 2, doesn't mean the system necessarily is any healthier. It just means it's going to be a little calmer for the time being because the parties are not at each other's throats. And then sometimes there are congregations that are so designed that unless they're fighting, they couldn't stay together. They're hostilely dependent in their organization. Remember I said one of the key ways to get close to people is through play? Well, if you can't get close to people through play, what's your only other option? Hostility, biting, shooting, guilting, shaming, complaining, etc. And then you're connected in a very negative kind of way, but you're still connected. How many of you think your congregation's been in conflict in the last 5 years? Oh, take everybody's name down. I got a 2-year project here. How many think they've been in a severe conflict? Okay, so that's about half the group. It usually takes a congregation 2 to 5 years, if they've been in a moderate to severe conflict, to kind of move out of it and reorganize. And some people, when I hear that, boy, they get angry with me. I was with a very wealthy Episcopal church in the Midwest, and when I said that, I thought they were going to string me up and crucify me, because these folks don't delay gratification. Wow. I said, all I'm telling you is my experience, folks. But the better decisions you make now, and the better progress you're going to make. But, you know, there's going to be loss, there's going to be anger, there's going to be grieving, and so forth. And what often happens after a major conflict is congregations don't do enough grieving. They say, let's pack it all up and be positive and move on and forget what happened. But that doesn't help. That doesn't help anybody. It's going to come back up again. And what happens, I just talked to a couple of major people in the grief therapy area, and they said, what you need to do when you're grieving is slow down. Slow down. Take some space. Take some time. But grief has its own timetable. It has side tracks, bypasses, leaps forward. It doesn't necessarily always go in a linear way. And normally it takes about 18 months. And of course you'll have a dive down again on the anniversary. That's been proven, of the death. And what happens so often in congregations, how do you grieve the loss of a beloved staff member. How do you grieve the loss of something significant in the life of the congregation? I mean, we have rituals for the loss of life, but we don't always have rituals for other losses that can be highly emotional in our lives. And I just see congregations too much in a rush to get healthy again. I will say this, I have never experienced a congregation benefiting because they were in a hurry. I can't cite an example. And in our society, we're always in a hurry, but we need to allow time for things to process. And by the way, that's one of my definitions of a mature, well-differentiated person. Rather than being bound by their instinct like an infant and needing it now, the mature person can allow for things to process, that things will move around. Differences by themselves do not create differing. It's the amount of emotionality that is attached to the differences. That's why we have to pay attention to the emotional processes. And there are times when we have to let the dust settle or things cool off, because at the moment it wouldn't be appropriate to try to deal with it because the emotionality is too high. That's why I do like to drag out the process 3 or 4 months, because I know I'll have more thinking brain available to me 2 or 3 months down the line than I have when I immediately go into the congregation when it's highly anxious. So pay attention to a process. And I have learned that a structured process, dealing with things when they're anxious with a structured process, puts a net around the anxiety. It stops some of the hemorrhaging. And people are a little more confident that something can happen because there's a process that's there to address the issue.